Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all your faces. My name is Mindy Kashwagi. I'm the Director of Membership here, and I recognize many of you from many years of these members' talks. Welcome to this afternoon's talk, and welcome to Members Month, the entire month of October. I wanted to take the opportunity to give Jess Nixon over there in the corner a huge shout out. She's the one who kind of orchestrates all these great talks for you all year round. So thank you to those of you in the room, and we have a great number of people, our members, our loyal members online as well. So hello to the virtual membership out there. So today we are so lucky to be joined by Head Librarian Rebekah Kim and Research Collections Registrar Lindsay Hazen for a deep dive into the history of the African Hall exhibit and the people behind it. This is a fascinating talk. And just a quick reminder that during the Q&A session, I'll be running this funny little mic around so that the people both in the room and online can hear your questions. So without further ado, welcome, and please join me in welcoming Rebekah and Lindsay.
Hi, I'm Rebekah Kim. And today, like Mindy said, we're going to do a deep dive into the history of an African Hall, how it came to be, and reflecting on what it means to us today.
You said the remote was easy.
I know it worked earlier this, right when we were, here we go. Sorry, bear with us a little bit. So our museum was built and currently stands on the land of the Ramaytush, Ohlone, and Muwekma people. We would be remiss to discuss the history of the Academy without acknowledging the Academy's ongoing impact on the indigenous people that lived and continue to live on the land we occupy. We perpetuate colonial practices by merely occupying this land. The California Academy of Sciences was founded in 1853. The founders saw that we have on this coast a virgin soil with new characteristics and attributes, which have not been subjected to critical scientific examination. Foundations of the Academy were driven by a desire to understand natural history of the region, but also about uncovering the availability of economic resources and resources that would support human populations on the land. The idea of virgin soil, which encompasses the pioneering spirit, fails to acknowledge the Ramaytush, Ohlone, and Muwekma people who have lived on these lands. Also, it fails to recognize they have been carefully managing and tending these lands for millennia and were systematically removed and murdered by the state and the federal government to make room for new settlers. Our founding is firmly rooted in a settler colonial mindset. The Oxford language defines settler colonialism as a type of colonialism in which the indigenous peoples of a colonized region are displaced by settlers who permanently form a society there. So I'm going to talk about the early American taxidermy and how it evolved into dioramas, which are a staple of natural history museums in America. The evolution of American natural history museums. Early natural history museum exhibits, including the Academy, were a way to display research collections. The photo on the left is a photo of a natural history display at the Smithsonian from the late 19th century. And the photo on the right is an image of the Academy's exhibit on Market Street from the same time period. Yeah. With the mammoth, which is sort of iconic at that time period. So Cabinet of Curiosities. Exhibits were displayed, museums exhibits at that time were displayed like cabinets of curiosities. There wasn't much taxidermy, and they were arranged by taxonomic groups. So often things were organized by animal groupings. The photo on the left is the American Museum of Natural History, AMNH from now on, so I don't have to say that all the time. Their Fossil Mammal Hall from 1900, and the photo on the right is from 1882 of their bird specimens. Early American taxidermy. These are some examples of early American taxidermy. Taxidermy is the art of preparing, stuffing, and mounting the skins of animals. Preservation was pretty difficult, and so before the use of insecticides, they weren't commonly seen in museums. In the 1800s, with the advent of preservatives, mountain animals became a regular part of natural history displays. And so these are just images from the AMNH from 1882. And often taxidermy around this time period would be just like a single animal on display. And so group habitats, which is kind of the next step in the evolution of natural history displays. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, artisans start to hone in on the craft of taxidermy, and mounted animals were being shown in groupings, but still as standalone displays in a case. Dioramas, which was the next step, were group habitats in their natural setting. And Lindsay is going to talk a little bit more about that sort of how that comes to be. So this dioramas were partially a response to urbanization and industrialization. There were some reports in the late 1800s that children were completely ignorant of the natural world. So habitat dioramas were the beginnings of a conservation movement, that if people were engaged with nature, that they would care about conserving the natural world. The photo on the left is an exhibit from the Smithsonian of a group of bison or American buffaloes that were collected and mounted by William Temple Hornaday, who's an early taxidermist, in 1886. And the photo on the right is the AMNH's Summer Bird Life exhibit from 1903, and it's thought to be one of the very first habitat dioramas. And you can see there's a bit of a mural in the background, and it's not in a case. So now Lindsay is going to talk about the process and artistry of taxidermy.
All right. So as we evolved in taxidermy, the main thing is that they're using the animal's real skin and hide, but they often have glass eyes and other parts of them are fabricated. So just a quick overview of the process is you're going to take a measurement of the animal in the field. You're going to sculpt the animal out of clay. So you're going to model and contour the muscle. Then you're going to create a plaster cast of the clay model and create a mold of the animal, a mannequin, which you can now buy. You don't have to do all the clay parts. And then you're going to add the hide of the animal to the mold, add the eyes, add the makeup, and you have taxidermy. Pictured here is the molding process. This is actually Academy staff working in the 1930s on a specimen for African Hall. I'd be remiss talking about taxidermy if I didn't talk about bad taxidermy. The original bad taxidermy was mainly not great because they weren't looking at live animals. So museums were receiving the hide and the bones, but didn't necessarily know what the animal looked like in life. So pictured here is Leo, the lion of Gripsholm Castle in Sweden. And the other is what I like to call party sloth. And that's actually a piece in the Academy's collection. And I can't just do one slide. So there was actually a movement in early taxidermy, which was making animals into furniture. This is a bear dumbwaiter holding drinks for arriving guests by Roland Ward. And the other is actually a mountain lion from our collection. And he's not furniture, but he just looks cross-eyed. So even in our early best attempts. And sort of what Rebekah had hinted at, dioramas. So diorama literally means through that which is seen or to see through, and was first used by Louis Jacques I don't speak French, Dogger, of daguerreotype fame. And we're actually credit Olaf Gieling, who was a scientist and taxidermist, with the term diorama to describe these early habitat scenes. As Rebekah mentioned, they started to appear in museums in the late 1800s, but it was really at the Columbia Exposition in 1893 in Chicago that really started to display some of the real lifelike taxidermy. And as circuses and newly established zoos were bringing more quote unquote exotic species to the Americas, the museum public demanded more. So taxidermy mounts were starting to be shown in their natural environment. And this means that they needed to include landscape design, which includes background paintings to create an illusion of spatial depth. And I'm going to hand it back to Rebekah to give us some context of the Academy history.
So I'm just going to do a quick history of the Academy to set the context for how Simpson African Hall comes to be. So the Academy was founded on April 4th, 1853 at 129 Montgomery, which is 3 years after California becomes a state and the city of San Francisco is incorporated. The main goals of the Academy was to gather a cabinet of specimens, and then also to collect and share scientific literature to talk about current ideas on natural history and science. In 1874, the Academy opened its first museum on DuPont, which is now Grant. In 1891, the Academy moves to a new building at 819 Market Street. The Market Street Museum was 6 stories, and it included 2 separate buildings. The front building, which you can see on the right, was held commercial offices that were leased, and the income from renting those spaces supported research in the museum. And on the left is just a photo of taxidermy bears on the 2nd floor, and maybe one of them is holding something. It's hard to tell.
Could be furniture.
Yeah, maybe furniture. This is the only image we have of that particular exhibit. Probably the biggest shared moment in San Francisco's collective history is the 1906 earthquake and fire, which was a transformative event for the city of San Francisco and the Academy. On April 18, 1906, at 5:12 a.m., an earthquake of an estimated magnitude of 7.9 hit San Francisco. Fires raced through the city following the earthquake, and nearly every item in the Market Street building was destroyed, including much of the building itself. A handful of things were spared, and fortuitously, the Academy had sent out an expedition to the Galapagos in 1905 for a year-long collecting trip. And that expedition returned with 76,000 new items on Thanksgiving Day in 1906, which would help the Academy rebuild. And so these are just photos of the destruction from the earthquake and fire afterwards. To prevent future loss from an earthquake and fire, the Academy lobbied to move to Golden Gate Park. The Academy sits on the location that was the Mechanics Art Building from the 1894 California Midwinter International Exposition that was held here in the park. This gave the Academy a moment to reinvent itself into a bigger, better, and more modern museum. And so I love this image because it kind of shows the Academy, how it expanded over time. And the Academy's footprint is the same as it is in this image as it is now. So this shows the very first building was North American Hall in 1916. And then came the Steinert Aquarium in 1923. We're celebrating its centennial this year. And then Simpson African Hall in 1934. And a fun fact, African Hall is in the exact same location. And we even retained one of its walls to keep the Academy's rebuild a renovation. So I'm going to pass it on to Lindsay, who's going to talk about North American Hall.
To me again. Okay. So as Rebekah mentioned, North American Hall is the first component that we opened up in Golden Gate Park. And the focus was on conservation and featured species on the brink of extinction. And so this is sort of this theme of these early dioramas really being a practice of conservation. There's a quote from Scientific American that I'd like to read. This was after we opened. The California Academy of Sciences, whose new museum in Golden Gate Park, San Francisco, was opened to the public in September 1916, has now the most up-to-date museum in the world and the most beautiful and artistic mammal groups ever created. This is an interesting line I'm about to read. This is the opinion not only of enthusiastic supporters of the institution, but of scientific museum men as well, men who are unprejudiced and who are entirely competent to judge such matters. Going to be a theme in our talk. So the hall was composed of 15 large mammal habitat groups and 6 bird groupings, as well as 26 smaller habitat groups. And this is the first time that we have documented that the Academy displayed scene dioramas. So this is looking down the hall, and you can also see that there's some mounted animals between the dioramas. So I'm just going to do a very quick overview of some of the dioramas to just sort of build the language and then just sort of how we used to talk about this exhibition and why it was being practiced. So we have the Tule elk scene. These animals came from Buttonwillow, Kern County in California, and from the ranch of Miller and Lux. Fun fact, if you live in San Francisco, there's actually a restaurant called Miller and Lux in the Chase Center, which is named after this ranch. The Academy collected these species because they were under threat of extinction. and we were part of their conservation effort to move them to Marin County. You're going to hear this name a lot on today's presentation, but this whole exhibit is credited to John Rowley. That's one person. With note that the background was painted by Charles Abel Corwin. I worked at exhibits for 6.5 years, so there's no way that only one person did this exhibit. The next one is the pronghorn antelope. At this time, the entire species was extinct up into California, Oregon, and Washington. So the West Coast, we had them alive. Everywhere east of us, they were extinct. Again, credited to John Rowley. This is the stellar sea lion. It was a threatened species at the time. This is showing the breeding rookeries on Ani Huevo Island. And shocking, John Rowley alone. And this is, actually, this was a gift presented to us from William Crocker. The animals were. There's 11 species of birds, 10 seabirds and 1 land bird. And this was actually prepared by Paul Frere. And then lastly, the grizzly bear. So we already knew at this point that the California grizzly was extinct. And in the catalog, we mourned that loss. So these were collected from northern Wyoming, which is today in the area of Yellowstone National Park. And so when Rebekah and I were talking about it, it was just like such an interesting manifestation of the use of dioramas. Like this hall was specifically built to inspire San Franciscans to care about these animals going extinct. And so it's a practice of conservation. And I think also of note that in the mindset, it was appropriate to take multiples of an endangered species, including breeding pairs and, like in this example, cubs. So if you didn't pick up the snark earlier, I don't think John Rowley was capable of doing an entire diorama of that scale on his own. So here's an image of the exhibits department in the 1930s. And this photo shoot is the first time I could find in our archives of visualizing the larger team. Diorama development took landscape muralists to paint the background scenes, top-notch preparators to craft the mounts, and a group of designers and artisans to create the environment in between. So I'm going to go through some of our well-known Academy history folks in the exhibits department. This is Frank Tos. He was actually born in England from modest means, and he'd had no formal education. He came to North America, first Canada, then the US when he was 20, and he just had a hobby of taxidermy that became a profession. He started at the Academy in 1922 and became the chief of the Department of Exhibits in 1927. He participated in field expeditions with the Academy, including traveling to Africa with Leslie Simpson in 1930. He's remembered, and this is a quote, "Gifted in every line of museum's preparator's art, and was one of the few men who could, alone and unaided, create a complete and satisfying habitat group, mounting the animals, building the rockwork, reproducing the vegetation, painting a convincing background, and achieving a balanced lighting effect. So I may stand corrected that you could do it all alone." I think this quote is interesting because it highlights what was admired and celebrated and somewhat expected of exhibits and dioramas in this era. Oh, that other picture is one of his from his journal, just sketching flora. So this is Velma Harris. Under Frank Tos, we have documentation that he recruited volunteers. Velma Harris was a student of the California School of Fine Arts and began to volunteer in the exhibits department in 1931. Her talent for creating three-dimensional models garnered her a position in the exhibits department in 1940. She is remembered as having super sight because she didn't have to use magnifiers in her work. And she often referenced the insects living on the plants. So in a lot of her painting, you'll notice small insects. So pictured here is Velma working. And then the second image includes her Velma, an unnamed artisan, and Dorothy Stockler. It's kind of the lady plants. And so what was super interesting is when we were researching this, Rebekah found all this information on how to make wax plants. And it's a really, really detailed labor. And so what I thought was so fascinating is that every single leaf and every diorama was created by hand, and they were all individual. And I sit in the herbarium, and I asked a botanist, like, how many leaves are on a tree? And she was just like, well, I need a lot more detail than that. But it's a lot when you also think about how many dioramas there were. Next up is Toshio Asada. This is a favored preparator of Rebekah and myself. He was born in Tokyo and then moved to the United States in 1923, first to New York and then San Francisco. And from the 1920s to 1965, he has somewhat of an academy connection. First, in going on expeditions as a scientific illustrator and collector, he actually brought back some of the first live animals for the Steinhardt Aquarium. And then later as an assistant preparator and the associate curator of exhibits. He was interned at Topaz, but did return to the Bay Area. And interesting enough, he really supported going out and seeing animals in their live environment and was quoted as saying, "One must know nature itself, that's the main thing." He did much of the work for the African annex, which you'll see some images of later. Here he's working on a warthog, and he's also on expedition in the Galapagos. And then we have Cecil Toos. He was actually Frank Toos's son, born in Canada but raised in San Francisco, proudly attended all public schools in San Francisco. He's actually listed as a student assistant at age 12 in the Academy Annual Report. So he apprenticed under his father and then received professional training at the James Clark Studio in New York. After World War II, he was appointed to the head of the exhibits department and was, quote, "a brilliant planner of exhibits. All of the Academy's newer exhibits, with their emphasis on color, lighting, and pleasing arrangement, are a tribute to his genius." So this is a student image of him, and he is developing the water buffalo diorama. So really, I just wanted to highlight, because it really does take a very large team to create these installations, and that they're all really craftspeople with a lot of creativity and a lot of artistry. We were getting a lot of press as we were developing African Hall, and I'd be remiss if I didn't note that we had to contract out a fair amount of our taxidermy to an Eastern firm called Jonas Brothers. They were not a musical group back then. And then we also received a lot of money from the Works Progress Administration. The WPA funding supported the museum project, which includes the background painting in African Hall, constructing exhibit accessories, packing and storing materials, and laying tile floor. So now these are just wonderful photos that Rebekah found in the archives. So you can see here, this is our giraffe. It's still on display in our East Hall. And this is the plastic, I'm presuming the mannequin. And there's a smaller version. And then there's a bongo. And now I'm going to hand it back to Rebekah to explain, why do we have an African Hall?
Thanks, Lindsay. So I'm going to talk about how African Hall came to be and why it had to be Africa. A lot of it has to do with Leslie Simpson, who is pictured here. Leslie Simpson was born in 1867 in San Francisco to a wealthy family who were one of the early California pioneers and made much of their wealth from the gold rush. He grew up on a large estate near what is now Mills College in Oakland, and from a young age, he learned how to hunt and taxidermy animals from his father. He got a degree from the College of Mining at UC Berkeley in the late 1800s. And so that's Leslie Simpson with a lion, and Leslie Simpson, just a portrait. So Leslie Simpson made his own personal fortune as a mining engineer in South Africa in the late 1800s and early 1900s. After graduating from college, he worked for the Consolidated Goldfields of South Africa, which was a British gold mining company founded in 1887 in Transvaal Colony, which is now South Africa and Eswatini. And the company was founded by politician and entrepreneur Cecil Rhodes, who founded the De Beers Mining Company. Leslie worked for the Consolidated Goldfields, which were a network of mines. And the photo on the left is him with his fellow mining engineers, and it's Leslie Simpson is on the top left. The image on the right is a photo, and it's titled Native Employees of the Simmer and Jack Mine from 1903. I show this picture to illustrate the fact that mining's workforce consisted mainly of Black migrant workers from throughout South Africa, and they were not well paid. They made about 1/9 of the wage of a white miner. And they were housed in compounds, which made it facilitated control and reduced the costs for the mining companies. And the mining industry really grew from imperialist interventions by Britain and the industrialization of mining technology. In 1910, Leslie Simpson retired from mining and became a, quote, great white hunter. The term great white hunter, I mean, we can use it differently now, but the context at the time was honorific, is used for professional big game hunters of European descent and that worked in Africa and in the first half of the 20th century. Big game hunting was centered mostly in East Africa and was a romantic European conception of hunting that combined privilege and sportsmanship. So it was right up Leslie Simpson's alley. Simpson was the real deal, great white hunter. He killed over 1,300 lions in his lifetime and assisted in taking 1,000 lions and 1,000 others. Much of this was from bounty hunting. Lions had a bounty on them for colonial entities. He even gave Theodore Roosevelt advice about hunting in Africa. Museums exhibits gave Simpson a reason and an authority to continue hunting large game in Africa. The Academy's Simpson African Hall isn't his first foray into developing a mammal hall like that. And he and John Rowley, who I'm going to talk about in more depth, but also was mentioned earlier, pitched this similar idea to the Oakland Museum and later the Natural History Museum in LA. In 1928, Leslie Simpson makes a generous offer to the Academy to go to Africa, that he would go to Africa to collect specimens and then donate $150,000 for a building of a hall. He spent about 3 to 5 years hunting in Kenya, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Zambia, and many other countries in mostly East Africa. This is when the British Empire was alive and well, and when seeking permission, he and the Academy often corresponded with colonial powers. This is a recurring thing. He is solely credited for supplying all animals in African Hall, but this isn't the whole story. Big game hunting is a huge endeavor, and it required the labor of many people, like porters, tent attendants, armed guards, horse trainers, gun bearers, preparators, scouts, cooks, and so many more. Before the mass importation of motor vehicles, most safaris traveled on foot and horseback and could employ anywhere from 50 to several hundred African workers. Even like Simpson wrote a little narrative about his time for the exhibit catalog, and he talked about how he hired a canoe with 12 people that paddled him 90 miles for about 10 hours while he lied down in a deck chair under an awning in the canoe. Leslie Simpson only ever acknowledged one African worker on his expedition, and his name is Madola from Kenya. And the image on the left is most likely him. And this image is from a book from John Rowley. John Rowley said he was trained by Carl Ackley. And if you know about African taxidermy and big game hunting, he's one of the most famous hunters and taxidermists. Rowley praised Madola and his assistants for their skill and attention to detail, which is critical when preparing them in the field. The image on the right is a photo from one of Simpson's camps. In 1939, Leslie Simpson died by suicide in his home in Oakland Hills. He was 72. And this is John Rowley, he and Leslie Simpson were very close. He dedicated one of his books to Leslie, so they had a very close bond, and it very much shapes how our hall comes to be. John Rowley was born in Hastings, New York in 1866. He graduates from Columbia University with a law degree in 1888. He abandons being a lawyer to pursue his passion for taxidermy, which was a childhood hobby of his. And he works at the AMNH in 1889. And in 1892, he becomes the chief of exhibits. Sorry, I'm going to go back real quick. So that's John Rowley on the left, and then on the right is him preparing a moose. He wrote 2 books talking about taxidermy and museum exhibits, and so these are some of the images that come from that. At the AMNH, he constructed a habitat of moose, as a companion piece to their bison exhibit. And this was the first large mammal group in the US and possibly the world to be adorned with model accessories. So all the plants and rocks, and this is still in its own case. In 1903, he moves to California. He's hired by David Starr Jordan, who is an ichthyologist and the founding president of Stanford University. And he's hired to build Stanford's natural history collection. The earthquake of 1906 destroys Stanford's Natural History Museum. And then Rowley's sought after by the Academy to help them reestablish themselves with a new building in Golden Gate Park. With his skill as like a master taxidermist in group habitats, he and the Academy launched an ambitious project to create an entire building devoted to just dioramas of North American mammals. His time at the Academy is devoted to building this hall, and he takes all the credit for it, as Lindsay mentioned. But because the Academy had no building at the time, he prepares all his animals in his home in Berkeley, filling every spare inch, it says. Also during this time, he somehow becomes friends with Leslie Simpson, which will change the course of his career and set the foundation for African Hall. After the launch of North American Hall, Rowley is pursued by the Oakland Museum, and there he makes plans for an African Hall with Leslie Simpson donating the materials. Those plans fall through, which is a really fascinating story, but I don't have time to go into it. And then Leslie Simpson makes a new offer to the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles and makes sure John Rowley is on staff there. So Rowley then moves to LA in 1920. Things don't work out for him, and he's fired along with other museum staff as a result of a 1927 grand jury investigation that was investigating the delays of the opening of the Natural History Museum LA's Simpson African Hall. And a lot of the delays were due to internal staff conflicts, Rowley being in the middle of that. Rowley dies in 1928 from pneumonia. He was 62. And so this is an image of the early plans for the Academy's African Hall. It doesn't end up quite being that, but it was very much inspired by John Rowley, who had conceptualized the Waterhole Group diorama in Oakland. And you'll see that that's on the side there on the very right. Though he didn't actually help in the installation of African Hall here in San Francisco, he was very much the one who put that idea together and set the wheels in motion. So African Hall opens in 1935 to the public, and like North American Hall, it was to inspire and educate people about the natural world due to modern cities and the disconnection from natural environments. It opens with a large waterhole group, 10 large, 1 intermediate, and 12 smaller groups of African mammals. And the collecting for this exhibit was extremely extractive. There was a total of 12 tons of materials that were brought over here, and it was so much material, the leftovers were in cold storage could fill 2 more buildings. So this is an image of the hall when it opens, and you can see the watering hole is on the end there. And so the star of this hall was the Waterhole Group diorama, which had an impala, a Maasai giraffe, zebra, wildebeest, Grant's gazelle, and Coke's hartebeest. This diorama was over 30 feet tall. It was probably one of the tallest exhibits at the time. And I've included an image from the catalog of sort of showing where the animals came from, which is just a dot on the continent of Africa. I've included this key for all the dioramas I'll be showing, just to show the lack of specificity when describing the hall. We often lump up Africa as just like one place, when it's made up of a multitude of countries and peoples and cultures. And Frank and Cecil Toast both got to work on this display, or they're the ones that are mentioned as working on this display. So the next example I'm showing, Frank Toast worked on, is Grevy's zebras. It's one of the most threatened species of zebra today, and these animals are still on display in some fashion, which Lindsay will kind of talk about a little bit later. The next display was a bush book, which Frank Toast worked on a lot of these dioramas, pretty much all of them. And the bush book is a medium-sized antelope, and this display does not come back after our renovations. So the next slide is just an example of two smaller dioramas, the hunting dogs and the Anubis baboons, which they're just smaller dioramas in the hall, and they are also not on display anymore. Both dioramas were worked on by Cecil and Frank Toast and Vera Betts. So this is a compilation of headlines that I collected about sort of the press's response to the opening of this hall. I'm not going to read through all of them, but the hall was definitely seen as a representation of Africa. The recurring, like some of the big recurring themes in the headlines is Africa is wild or savage, and that this hall is filled with trophies. And so now I'm going to pass it back to Lindsay, who will talk about the changes in this hall through time.
I like to say now we get to see things in color. So here's the, we'll get another picture of watering hole. So I wanted to show this one of the lions because here it is from the opening and here it is from like a year ago. So you can see that we didn't do a lot of changes on this. Oh, I guess I should mention that we did do a remodel. So we did close our building in 2003 and we reopened it and we opted to keep African Hall and certain dioramas. So you can still go into the hall and see this. And I was looking at our interpretation and we didn't really change our language that much since the 1980s. There was an 80s refresh, but the 80s to now hasn't really changed. Here's the watering hole group. This was a revamp from the 1980s where we actually took away the glass and we added a very inviting rock pathway and we included a soundscape so you could hear the different sounds of the animals. Here's 2004 as we're getting prepared to deinstall. Looking down, we have carpet in the hallway, but you can see that it still looks very similar to as it did when it opened. We have lit panels instead of plaques. In the 1950s, the hall, we wanted to do an expansion, so we actually added an area called the African Annex. And this is when Toshio and Cecil do a lot of the work. So this is a rhino and a hippo in the annex. We also have a warthog and a pangolin and some others. And the collection's a little, some of it's from a new collector, Dean Witter, who was also a big hunter, but some of it is some Simpson leftovers that we had in the collection. And we also added some birds. Also in the 1970s, we added this, we added a 40-foot long mural and a giant jigsaw puzzle. And this was new to me. And the text panel was Why Africa? And the explanation was because early humans lived there, because the remains are fossilized, because these fossils are unusually accessible, because our nearest primate relatives live there today. And so this included casts of fossil bones, and this mural purported to have 5,300 individual animals painted on it. This was added in 1975. And Rebekah and I wanted to include it because it's sort of a precursor to Human Odyssey that's currently on display in Tusher African Center. And here's this puzzle piece to explain it, and you can sort of see right into Simpson African Hall behind there. And here's another picture of watering hole because we love it. And then I just wanted to show some pictures of the deinstallation. So some of the mural pieces were saved, but most of them were not. And as you see things coming apart. And so here we are in the new building. We do have new flooring down there. So when we closed the building in 2003, we really rethought our public floor, but African Hall did come back. And it came back pretty much looking like the way it did when we closed the building. It's the only hall dedicated to traditional dioramas. And it was crafted with much of the original in mind. We now do have live African penguins where the open diorama watering hole once was. We did want to keep an open diorama, which is where you can now see the zebras. And I have a lot of paper here and I now don't know where my notes are. There we are. It also has the East African oryx and the gerenuk. And now I'm going to pass it back to Rebekah.
So I'm going to talk about Leona Kesho and sort of reimagining African Hall. This is a piece, this is a work that was developed by Walter Kitindu, who was an Osher Fellow from 2021 to 2022. This is a photo of Walter in front of his piece, Leona Kesho, that is still on display in African Hall. And I encourage all of you to see it, maybe even after this talk. Walter Kitindu is a Tanzanian-American multidisciplinary artist and educator. He creates sculptures, sound installations, and large-scale public artworks that address place, history, nature, and community. Walter is the director of Kitindu Studio, which focuses on the development and installation of public artworks. He received a MacArthur Fellowship in 2008, and in 2021, he was asked to be an Osher Fellow at the Academy in the wake of the George Floyd race riots. And I think the best way to talk about his work is, I'm just gonna read his artist statement. I tried, but I can't do it justice. So I will just read his artist statement, which I also provide links to at the end of this talk. This installation in African Hall is a storefront inspired by those in the Kariku district of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The work is a collection of references to the types of stores found in the area and informed by the artist's memory and associations. It is a response to the use of dioramas as a teaching tool and to their problematic history of extraction as a means to educate or entertain audiences at a distance. Dioramas are often exquisitely made by incredibly talented artisans. They are a wonder to behold, but their precise recreations are works of fiction meant to tell a story. The story is almost told from an external perspective. In the case of the continent of Africa, dioramas built in the West tend to look towards the past, toward an idealized natural scene, and ignore the built environment altogether. In a society that is uninformed about Africa, that rarely seeks specificity when referring to a continent of 1 billion people, and consistently receives problematic information about African countries and cultures, the diorama forms as practice does little to ground people in the reality of our shared existence. The history, contemporary life, and the intellectual and artistic work of African people is missing. And this absence does little to trouble those with problematic notions of the continent. This work is meant to be a provocation. It is meant to be seen in this context and communicate that people from Dar es Salaam, not just Africans in general, and more specifically those in the Kariku district, are living, listening, and going about their daily modern lives. It is meant to uproot visitors from an idealized and nostalgic stroll through African Hall and have them contend with the presence of the continent in a different way. This is an opportunity for all exhibits in the hall to be viewed more critically and to ensure that conversations about history, humanity, and our shared future will inform our interpretations of the natural world. And that's the end of the statement. And I have very much been, I personally, Rebekah Kim, have been very much provoked and inspired by this piece. It's made me really reflect about African Hall and ask how it came to be, which is why we're here talking about it today. So I really like to thank you, Walter. And I do want to leave on this note about, I've learned so much doing this talk, and I learn so much every day, but as I was doing research, I was looking for an image of a dramatic and revolutionary mount. It's called Lion Attacking a Dromedary, that was created by a French taxidermist, Edward Verreau, in 1867. It depicts a fictional scene of a man on a dromedary, which is a camel, struggling to fend off an attack by a Barbary lion. The diorama had, until a few days ago, been on display at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I think when I was just Googling, the most shocking thing for me was that in 2017, while doing sort of conservation and restoration work, they found out that the mannequin, the person, actually contained human remains. This image is the signage that they put up when they put it back on display in 2020. It is now off display. But it is a reminder that museums are rooted in colonialism and the history of science. And in the history of science, science has been used to justify racism and that it can really do actual harm. Scientific racism has justified so many things: slavery, colonialism, genocide, population control, anti-immigration policies, crime control policies, and so much more. I've talked a little bit about this in a previous member talk. But I want to just talk about that there is real human harm here. And I want to leave on a note about we should re-examine museum displays. You've learned a lot about African Hall, and ask, does this space still serve as a powerful education tool and inspire visitors as it had originally been intended? And how do we be more equitable and inclusive moving forward? And who's left out when we don't tell the whole story, especially where science, racism, and colonial powers are inherently entwined? And if you wanted to know more, there's a QR code and a link about more resources. And you can always just ask as well. And we want to thank you for being here. Thank Lindsay for joining me on this journey. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was interested.
Let me run the mic.
Can you wait for the mic?
I can talk loud.
There's people online.
And you won't be loud enough for the people online.
I'll just hold it.
Okay. In the presentation, you had the diorama of like the grizzly bears. Whatever happened to that? The pre-African dioramas.
We still have all the specimens in storage.
Oh,
So we still have them.
so we can have a storage tour then? Thank
That's
you.
another members event.
Yeah.
San Diego recently, and they're kind of getting rid of dioramas, and I'm wondering what the philosophy is. I like them. I know animals were murdered and all, but what is the philosophy? Because it seems like the natural history one down in San Diego has gotten rid of so many of them, most of them.
I mean, I think when you think about context, so like a lot of these dioramas are built during a time where there is like air travel is difficult. There is no like video, internet, TV, right? And now we can see, like this would have been the only way to see some of these mammals, but now we can see them. We can see them online. You can actually visit some of them. So then like that, there has to be a thought about like what purpose does it serve? And we're not the only place that has an African mammal hall. A lot of places do because it was easy to get these kind of big mammals during like colonial times. So some
they're not really being destroyed. They're not really being destroyed. They're being saved and just not put out as much.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's rethinking what they're doing with their halls. Some places have kept them intact, like we have, and then some places have redone their halls differently so that they're not in like a habitat setting. They show a little bit more about biodiversity and sort of animal similarities. But it is, I mean, at the time, these dioramas were revolutionary and different from before. I don't think things have to stay the same always, and we should really think about what the mission is, about what we want to convey with these. Yeah.
I have a different opinion. I feel like it's kind of criminal to get rid of this beauty and this art because we didn't have the opportunity to go many places during my entire childhood. But one of the places I saw when I was 5, and I remembered it my entire life, was the African Hall. And it didn't have, I wasn't interested in TV. It didn't have the same impression on me. But to see that was just made me love the art and the animals and the respect of the people who made this. And it's just, I feel that feeling in my heart to this day. It was just so precious that I would hate to see it being destroyed because it's the popular thing to do today. Does it mean that because Carnegie workers, even though he was an impoverished or probably almost starved to death when he was a child in Scotland. But, and then in the steel and mill industry, that's been getting rid of all the steel and what we have. I mean, I think just respecting what they've done is just, I just admire just being in so I'm grateful that we still have it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone knows, but I don't have the power to do anything in those halls. I'm just the librarian here, but I do admire the artistry. I mean, it is a real skill and art to make them lifelike. And some of the people that Lindsay talked about are like personal heroes of mine. But I do think talking about that hall in its full context and whole story is important. And I don't think we're alone in this. A lot of Lindsay and I just came from a museum session where we're talking about monuments and people like rethinking what those mean, what they mean to people, but also like what the hall means to people who are from Africa. They don't see their space in there. I mean, there are only animals in that space. I mean, Walter's piece does bring in some human element, but other than that, it's all like, do we think of Africa as a prehistoric place? Like, what is the perception we're putting forward? So I think it just requires a little thinking. I have no power, and I'm not asking to like make any.
It gets to be a mess. So I think you're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, I think you can ruin the whole thing by trying to spread yourself too thin. I think if you have a book or something delving into these other issues, but take something that's so beautiful and so precious and artistic, there's something that's beyond, you have to look at the feeling that you get, and that could be lost by trying to make it more complex. I feel like.
Thankfully that's not my job. I'm not in the exhibits either. So but and I will say, like, African Hall, the star right now are those penguins. If you ever go in there, there's always like a ton of children around the penguins.
And that was something else we wanted to do with this project, was figure out who made them. It's not really well, if you look in the catalog records, one person gets credit for the dioramas. So really like delving into our own history, like, wow, we did employ a lot of different types of people who are doing a lot of incredible work, and actually letting them shine too. Because when you open the catalog record, you see one person's name, and that's not very fair either. This is a I mean, I had to talk to Jess. This was a members talk.
We have a question back here.
Firstly, ladies, thank you very much for a wonderful talk and your time. Obviously, there's a lot of value judgments and troublesome history with these exhibits, but obviously a lot of benefit as well. Is there any data-driven work being done to see how much benefit there is in, a diorama versus something alternate?
No, I mean, I don't know. I'm not in the exhibits team, so I don't know. Do you know, Lindsay?
I think the museum field is talking about it, at least in the last couple of years, really re-examining our spaces in general. Like, are we a convening space? Are we an educator? Are we informal education? So I think these are all topics that museum professionals are starting to delve into. I don't think there's a handbook right now, because we're all, balancing the same things that we're talking about right now, the nostalgia or just the beauty of the art piece, but what's also the impacts of that, and where is our complacency and our opportunity. And I think that's just something we're all discussing and navigating together right now. But I don't think there's any museum out there that's like, this is the correct course, now follow me. We're all talking to each other.
But that would be good to have some data to like think about because they're to educate. These exhibits are to educate, to compel people. It would be nice to see if it's making those same impacts. Yes, another question.
Well, sort of to riff off of this idea, I'm just curious if you've noticed any even anecdotal evidence about sort of generational differences. So sort of the TikTok generation, how do they interact with these dioramas versus maybe other generations where it sparks more nostalgia?
Yeah, I have small children, and we've come to the Cal Academy. They usually run from Human Odyssey, which is on one end, and then to the penguins. Sometimes they'll like look at the dioramas, but I think it is different for them. They grew up in, like, they have so much rich visual material out there. It's not the same. And for them, they love those penguins. So can't.
We have a very intentional and thoughtful exhibits department, so I have every bit of faith that they are doing the correct metrics.
Yeah. Any other questions? Questions about taxidermy? I mean, we could talk about that. Arsenic apparently was very helpful and it's as a preservative. Yeah, hi.
Thank you for mentioning the colonialism and the Ramaita Shaloni. One thing, when I was a little kid, we were told that the taxidermied gorilla has human hair. Is that true?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I know that gorilla was purchased as a mounted specimen. So it's one of the few items that weren't mounted internally or like contracted out. And it was on loan, and it's by the same, I forgot, taxidermist who made the bear table. But so that would be the late 1800s. So I don't know, and I don't know if we've done anything with the gorilla. Do you know, Lindsay?
Yeah. We actually, oddly enough, we commissioned a piece on Salam, which is an Australopithecus afarensis, which is sort of like Lucy's daughter. And we have a sculptural representation from Atelier Danes in France. And they actually used human hair that was collected from a hairdresser up the street who wanted to donate the hair. And so the participants accepted that. I mean, it was complete consent. So like we have that has human hair.
Yeah.
That's very well documented and cared for as such. But I don't know about the gorilla.
And I think also with the Carnegie exhibit is there's so little documentation of when they get those things that they only found out after they x-rayed. Right, to do conservation work that there were human remains in there. There was no documentation about that, I think, previously.
I think one more question.
2 cents one more time on the diorama, saving it. I noticed that there may be, I'm just throwing this out as a maybe, people pay more attention to the penguin exhibit rather than the dioramas, just because you actually have somebody explaining the penguins down there. You have no docent who is explaining the dioramas. I'm a docent for San Jose History Park, which is a huge complex, and I usually do the fruit barn. And so people have lots of questions, so they want to you start interacting with the public about, like, let's say the bongos, and then people will tell their own personal story, that's a wonderful thing when you have somebody and then they want to tell you, well, when I was in Kenya. And so then it becomes a richer experience. So that's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
That was last question. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.